In this video, we are going to be talking about our first serial murder case. We are going to be going over the horrific cult killings of the Manson family. I mean, no disrespect to any of the families in this video, and everything in this video is all public information found on the internet that I have compiled into one video. On the 12th of November 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, a 16-year-old girl gave birth to a little boy that she named Charles Miles Manson. The father was not around during the pregnancy or when the child had been born either. In fact, Charles never met his father. As a young single mother, money was always a problem, and this led her to go down a path where she ended up getting incarcerated for armed robbery. This forced Charles to go live with his aunt and uncle in West Virginia. His life didn't seem to improve much though, as starting at the age of 9, he began the cycle of getting locked up and released from juvie for crimes such as petty larceny, armed robbery, burglary, and auto theft. When he got released from jail in 1967, at the age of 32, he moved to San Francisco where he started to get a bit of a following. He would preach the coming of an apocalyptic race war that he gave the name Helter Skelter. By 1968, he was the leader of a cult more commonly known as the Manson family. He had such a tight hold over his followers that in 1969, only 2 years after it was created, he ordered his followers to kill several people. Gary Hinman was born in Colorado on Christmas Eve in 1934. He graduated high school with a degree in chemistry and continued to UCLA, where he was close to receiving his PhD in sociology. He was a talented musician who worked at a music shop teaching the bagpipes, trombone, piano, and drums. Sometime in 1968, he became interested in Nichiren Shoshu Buddhism, and he was planning a trip for the summer of 1969 to go to a religious pilgrimage in Japan. Gary had become friends with several members of the Manson family and often let them stay in his home. On July 25th, 1969, Manson family members Bobby Beausoleil, Mary Brunner, and Susan Atkins decided to pay Gary a visit at his home. Charles Manson believed that Gary had investments in stocks and bonds and owned his house and cars. He wanted them to convince him to join the family, which included turning over all of his assets. Bobby said that they went there because Gary had sold him some bad mescaline and he wanted to get his money back. Whatever the reason for their visit, things went bad. At some point during the 3 days of violence, Charles and another family member, Bruce Davis, stopped by. When he arrived, Charles Manson raised a sword to Gary Hinman and struck him in the head, slicing his left ear and his face. Mary and Susan stitched him up with dental floss. Gary Hinman did not fight back, as he didn't believe in violence. Instead, he was consistently asking them to leave his home. It all ended on the 27th of July when Bobby stabbed him twice in the chest before taking turns with Mary and Susan holding a pillow over his face. He died on the floor holding his prayer beads in hand, reciting a chant of his faith. He was the first victim of the Manson family. Bobby then proceeded to write "political pig" and drew a paw print on the wall in an attempt to get authorities to believe that the Black Panther Party, which was made up of African Americans, were to blame. Sharon Marie Tate was born January 14, 1943 in Dallas, Texas. Her dad was in the United States Army and was promoted and transferred several times. This meant that by age 16, Sharon had lived in many different cities and found it very difficult to maintain friendships. In her teen years, she won many beauty pageants which led her into modelling. Her father was stationed in Verona, Italy, so she attended the nearby American high school in Vicenza, where she was nominated both Homecoming Queen and Prom Queen. She was cast in a few Italian films as an extra, which led her to meet American actor Richard Beymer, who encouraged her to pursue her interest in acting and gave her the card of his agent Hal Gefsky. Once her father had been restationed back in the United States in 1963, she followed and hitchhiked to Hollywood so she could meet up with Hal Gefsky. Due to her beauty, she quickly landed roles in cigarette and automobile commercials and was consistently cast as an extra in films whilst also pursuing her modelling career. In 1967, when she was working on a horror spoof film called The Fearless Vampire Killers, she met director Roman Polanski and a romantic relationship bloomed. She was then cast as the main role in another film that Roman was working on that year called Valley of the Dolls, which led her to stardom. Sharon and Roman got married in 1968 and she fell pregnant in 1969. In the summer of 1969, Roman and Sharon were renting a house in an exclusive neighbourhood in Los Angeles. On August 8th, Roman was in Europe working on a film and Sharon had some guests over. Charles Manson ordered his followers to kill everyone in the house in the most gruesome way possible. He was familiar with the house because the previous tenant was a music producer that had considered giving him a recording contract but then decided against it. Upon arriving at the property, 4 members of the Manson family, Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, came across Stephen Parent first, an 18-year-old boy who was visiting the caretaker in the guest house. He was shot and killed instantly. All 4 people in the house were then gathered into the living room. Sharon and her ex-boyfriend turned friend, Jay Sebring, were tied together at the neck with ropes. They then shot and stabbed Jay. The other 2, Abigail Folger, the coffee heiress, and her boyfriend, Wojciech Frykowski, managed to escape, and as they were trying to flee, they were chased down and brutally murdered. Sharon, who was 8 months pregnant at the time, was stabbed and her blood was used to write pig on the front door. The following night, on August 9th, the 4 killers went for a drive with Manson. Apparently, Charles Manson was displeased with how chaotic the murders were and that 2 of them nearly got away. He told them to drive to a house in a different LA neighbourhood that he was familiar with because he had gone to the neighbouring house for a party in the last year. They arrived at the house of supermarket executive Lino LaBianca and his wife Rosemary. Charles Manson and Tex Watson woke up Lino, who was asleep on the sofa. He awoke to a gun pointing at him and Manson assuring him that they were only there to rob him. Charles Manson removed a leather thong from his neck and passed it to Tex Watson, who then proceeded to tie up Lino's hands. The intruders were then made aware that his wife, Rosemary, was in the bedroom sleeping. Charles Manson proceeded to go upstairs and wake her up. He allowed her to put a dress on over her nightgown and then led her back down into the living room. Manson was constantly trying to reassure them that the couple would not be hurt and that they were only getting robbed. Watson then proceeded to lead Rosemary back to the bedroom, placed a pillowcase over her head and tied it up and gagged her with a lamp cord. She was told to stay in the room and be quiet. Tex Watson then made his way back down into the living room where Charles Manson proceeded to leave the house completely. 2 other family members then entered the house within minutes. Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten were instructed to go to the bedroom whilst Tex Watson started to stab Lino repeatedly, only stopping when he started shouting, "Stop stabbing me." Rosemary began to freak out after she heard the pained cries of her husband. She began to flail around the room, screaming. Patricia and Leslie, they shouted Watson for help, who left the badly bleeding Lino on the living room floor. He entered the bedroom to find Rosemary flailing around, swinging the lamp with the lamp cord that had been used to gag her. He then lunged forward and stabbed her until she fell to the floor. The trio then proceeded to stab her 41 times. After Rosemary had died, Watson then went back to the living room to find Leno still breathing. He then proceeded to stab him until he was sure he was dead. One of the girls then proceeded to carve the word war into Leno's stomach, and they wrote messages on the walls with his blood. Death to Pigs and Rise was written on the living room wall, and Helter Skelter was misspelt on the refrigerator door. After the murders, the family members stayed in the house for a while, eating their food, playing with the couple's dogs, and even showering before hitchhiking back to the ranch that the cult had made their base out of. The following evening, Rosemary's son Frank had been dropped off at the house after returning from Lake Isabella. When he noticed that the blinds were drawn and his mother nor stepfather answered the door when he knocked, he made his way to a nearby payphone to call his sister Susan and express his concerns. Susan picked up her little brother with her boyfriend and they made their way back over to the house. They entered through a side door, and when they got into the kitchen and saw that there was a blood-written message on the refrigerator door, Susan stayed in that room because she didn't want to see what had happened. Frank and her boyfriend went into the living room to see Leno on the floor dead, and they ran to a neighbouring house to call the police. The police subsequently found Rosemary in the bedroom, also deceased. To begin with, police didn't link the murders at Sharon Tate's residence and the LaBianca's house, as they didn't see any connection. The difference in friends, the victims' lifestyles, nothing seemed to match. So on August 12th, LAPD announced that there was no link between the murders. Donald Shea was born in Massachusetts on September 18th, 1933. He served in the United States Air Force from December 1954 until June 1956. He moved to California to pursue a career in acting, mostly finding work as a stuntman. Later, he found work as a bouncer and as a ranch hand at Spahn Ranch, which was an old Hollywood movie set that had been turned into some horse stables. When the Manson family moved to Spahn Ranch, he existed peacefully with them at first, but that all changed when Charles Manson began to look down on Donald because he'd married a black woman named Magdalene. Manson hated and mistrusted black people and had become disgusted when Magdalene's friends had turned up at the ranch. Magdalene only stayed there for a few weeks before returning to Las Vegas. Eventually, Donald had planned with George Spahn, the owner of the ranch, to remove the Manson family as their brushes with the law were getting out of control. On August 26, 1969, Charles Manson had decided to have Donald Shea killed because he believed that Donald had reported him to the police, which resulted in a raid on August 16th, which had some family members arrested for auto theft. Manson told Bruce Davis, Tex Watson, and Steve Grogan to ask for a ride to a nearby car parts yard on the ranch. Bruce Davis sat in the back of the car with Steve Grogan, who hit Donald over the head with a lead pipe, and then Tex Watson stabbed him. After police had arrested some family members for auto theft, they kept Susan Atkins in police custody for her role in the death of Gary Hinman. While in jail, she was boasting to other inmates about her role in the unsolved murders at the Tate residence and the LaBianca's house. 2 inmates reported her to prison officials, and in December 1969, she provided testimony about the murders in front of a grand jury for an exchange of immunity from the death penalty. Charles Manson was already in prison because he broke conditions of his suspended sentence by receiving stolen items. Police indicted him on sexual charges, whilst Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten were arrested for their part in the murders. Linda Casbian, who was pregnant with her second child at the time, she was present at both nights of the murders. She agreed to be a witness for the prosecution in exchange for immunity. On June 15th, 1970, Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were put on trial for the murders at the Sharon Tate's residence and the LaBianca's house. Throughout the trial, the defendants were repeatedly banned from the courtroom for loud outbursts and refusing to follow the judge's orders. They were all found guilty on January 25th, 1971. 2 months of testimony then followed to determine sentencing. On March 29th, 1971, they were all sentenced to the death penalty, even Susan Atkins, despite her initial agreement to testify for immunity. Charles Tex Watson fled to his home state of Texas, where he was arrested on November 30th, 1969. His lawyers fought for 9 months to get him extradited back to California, where he would stand trial. When he finally returned to California, he deteriorated into a childlike state. He stopped talking and eating, losing 55 pounds. He was admitted to a state hospital where he had a 90-day observation period to observe whether he was fit to stand trial. In February 1970, they determined he was medically fit to stand trial and was released from the hospital. On October 12th, 1971, Charles Tex Watson was convicted of 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. A week later, the same jury only took 2.5 hours to determine that he was sane at the time of the killings. He was sentenced to the gas chamber on October 21st. On October 18th, 1970, Bobby Beausoleil was found guilty for the murder of Gary Hinman after Mary Brummer decided to testify for the prosecution. He was sentenced to the death penalty. Bruce Davis turned himself into the police on December 2nd, 1970. He was convicted for the murder of Donald Shea and Gary Hinman. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Steve Grogan was sentenced to the death penalty, but a judge ruled on December 23rd, 1971 that he was too stupid or hopped up on drugs at the time to decide anything on his own, and that it was actually Manson who decided who lived or died. He reduced his penalty to life imprisonment. None of the Manson family members were actually ever executed. February 18th, 1972, the state of California temporarily outlawed the death penalty, so all of their sentences got changed to life imprisonment. In 1976, Leslie Van Houten's murder conviction was overturned by a state court due to the grounds that the previous judge should have granted a mistrial when her attorney disappeared when he went on a camping trip on a 10-day recess during the original trial. His body was found March 1971, and a cause of death could not be determined. At least one Manson family member has claimed that other members had killed him in retaliation, but this could not be proven. Her first retrial resulted in a hung jury, which meant that the jury could not be swayed one way or another whether she could be convicted of murder. She was released on bond for a few months and tried for a third time in 1978. She was reconvicted of murder after the jury rejected her defense of diminished responsibility due to the prolonged use of hallucinogenic drugs. In 1987, Susan LaBarge, the daughter of Rosemary LaBianca, started to visit Tex Watson in prison. She attended his 1990 parole hearing, stating that he was a new man and no longer dangerous because of his newfound Christianity, and that he should be released from prison. Sharon Tate's mother and other members of the LaBianca family made it clear that she was not talking for all of the victims' families. Tex Watson has been denied parole 13 times and still remains in a California prison to this day. Leslie Van Houten has been denied parole over 19 times because the LaBianca family have made it their mission to attend their parole hearings and make sure that they do not get released. Susan Atkins remained in prison until she died of a brain tumour September 24, 2009. Because of her death, that means that Patricia Krenwinkel is now the longest incarcerated female in the California prison system, where she remains to this day. Bruce Davis began his life sentence April 21st, 1972. He became a preacher in the prison chapel and has had a clean disciplinary record since 1980. He was found suitable for parole in 2010, 2012, 2014, 2015, 2017, 2019 and 2021, but every time the sitting governor has either reversed the decision or called for a review. He got denied parole again in July 2022 when the parole board said that he lacked empathy. Steve Grogan is the only family member that has been released on parole. During his time in prison, he rehabilitated himself, got married and fathered 2 children. He was released in 1988 and has never spoken publicly about his time in the Manson Family Cult. He is now a musician who plays for many Bay Area bands. Charles Manson died November 19th, 2017 after he had a cardiac arrest due to complications from colon cancer. So, that brings us to the end of the Manson Family Cult story. I hope you found this interesting, and if you have any particular case you want me to look into, make sure you leave it in the comments down below, and if you want to read about this story, follow the link in the description to my blog. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss my next weekly case.